Greetings mortals and welcome to Mathamancy 101. The goal of this video is to basically explain how it is that I do my Arkmodes and put a huge amount of restrictions on myself and still have my characters end up as gods in the end. The basic flow of an Arkmode run is the very beginning of the game is extraordinarily difficult, and by the mid game I'm on relatively even kilter with where you would normally expect to be. By the end of the game, I'm unstoppable. And that's sort of the nature of anything where you have control over your build, is that if you build yourself correctly, then you will be unstoppable. And so the goal of this video is to explain the basics of how you can think about the numbers that are going into things in order to get yourself to the point where you become unstoppable. So let's get right into things. So the first thing that we need to work with is, what are we even looking at? So there's two basic types of modifiers. You have static modifiers and you have multiplicative modifiers. So with a static modifier, you're increasing or decreasing the base value by an arbitrary number that has nothing to do with the base value. So if you have a base value of 10 and you have a static modifier of 3, then you're just adding 3. If you have a base value of 100 and you have a static modifier of 3, you're still adding 3. Multiplicative modifiers are different because with a multiplicative modifier, you're changing the base value relative to the base value. So if you have, say, a 30% multiplicative modifier, you are multiplying by 1.3. So if the base value is 10, you have 13. If the base value, or 13, which is total, which is a 3 increase in your value. If you have a base value of 100, you now have 130, which is a 30 increase to the base value. So the percentage increase of a multiplicative modifier always remains the same. A static modifier can be more or less powerful depending on the base value. So now we're going to get a bit more in depth into static increases. So static increases are relatively simple. It's just a base plus a modifier is equal to the new total. So if you have 10 damage and you add a +2 strength modifier, you now have 12 damage. Not terribly complicated, but you can now add additional modifiers on top of that. So for instance, if you have the same 10 base damage and the same +2 strength modifier, if you're now determining, do I want to get weapon specialization or not? You can then look and see, okay, I'll go from 12 to 14 damage. It doesn't get too complicated, but there's a bit of a hitch. So when you're calculating how effective a given modifier is, you just do T1 over B, right? So just the total over the base. Not complicated. So the strength modifier is worth 20% increased damage. But once you have multiple modifiers, it changes somewhat, because if you're deciding, okay, I'm a relatively strong guy, is it worth it for me to get weapon specialization and increase my damage by another +2 when I already have +2 damage? The key is that for static modifiers, static increases, you have diminishing returns. The same amount of static increase isn't as effective once you already have static increases in play. So increasing from 12 to 14 is only a 16% increase in damage done. And that's important, a distinction to remember, is that as you keep adding +2s, this number will shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink. So as in the example from before, there's a big difference between adding 10 +2 versus 100 +2. So anyway, this number is what you always want to look at when you're making a decision in the build. But once you have your entire build, if you want to just see, okay, well, what do all these modifiers together give me collectively, you can then calculate the total change this way. So you see that you have a 40% overall increase. And the reason that these two numbers do not add up to 100%, or sorry, do not add up to 40%, this is a 20% increase over 100%. This is a 16% increase over 120%. So it adds up to be a 40% increase of the original value. Alright, so next we're going to talk about static decreases. Static decreases are a lot more fun and a lot more sexy than static increases. So with static decreases, you have a similar looking equation. It's just b minus m1 is equal to t1. Not super complicated. So if you have a goblin, particularly beefy and strong goblin, hitting you for 10 damage, and you have leather armor that decreases your damage taken by 2, then you take 8 damage. Not super complicated, basically the same as what we were looking at before. But here's where things start to get interesting, is when you add another modifier. So let's say that you have the same leather armor, and you now have a buckler, just some crappy buckler. So you're equipping a leather armor and then a shield. So with that leather armor and a shield, you're now looking at taking 6 damage instead of 10 damage, or 6 damage instead of 8 damage from adding on the buckler to wearing leather armor. So when you're calculating the change with one modifier, it's the same as with a static increase. But when you're calculating the change for additional modifiers, you now have accelerating returns, which you might have noticed here. This seems like it's kind of a bigger deal going from 8 to 6, and it really is. It's a substantially bigger benefit to go from 8 damage to 6 damage. So as an example, let's use the buckler example. If you had, say, a mage, someone who isn't wearing leather armor, and you give them some sort of, probably in the case of a mage, it's a buff that drops the damage that they take by 2, that's not as effective as having a guy in armor who's then adding another effect that drops it by 2. So it's better to have a shield and armor than it is to have either one individually. Each one will have accelerating returns. So let's say that you spring the money to upgrade from leather armor to chainmail, and it's giving you a -4 damage taken instead. This number is going to be it's 10 minus 4 minus 2, and that shield is now going to have, instead of a 25% decrease in your damage taken, it's going to be worth 33% damage. If you're upgrading to plate armor, let's say that you upgrade straight from leather to plate. You have a -8 to damage taken, and then all of a sudden you add a shield that gives you a -2 to damage taken. You now have a 100% decrease in damage taken, and you are invincible. It doesn't matter how long that goblin hits you for, it cannot kill you, because it cannot harm you in the first place. That is the power of static decreases, is that as they increase, as you increase the value of your static decreases to the point where they match the original value that they're decreasing, the original value ceases to do anything at all. So enemies can't hurt you. If you are reducing the chance for a status effect to activate, status effects can't land on you. There's all sorts of things that you can do with static decreases that are exceptionally awesome. So you can still calculate the total change as per normal, but it's important to remember that a 100% decrease is much stronger than a 100% increase. A 100% increase doubles the value. A 100% decrease nullifies the value. It makes it completely ineffective. So it's basically an infinitely large reduction in the thing, or the efficacy of the thing. If you want to deal damage and you have 100% of it nullified, you're no longer dealing damage at all. That's a much stronger effect than simply having the effect do twice as much as it started. So anyway, static decreases are extremely powerful, and these effects are one of the key ways that you handle Arkmode stuff without dying horribly. All right, next we're going to go into multiplicative increases. Now, multiplicative increases are fundamentally different from static increases in that a static increase, it doesn't matter whether you have a +4 or a +2 and then another +2. The overall effect is +4. There's no difference between those things. With multiplicative increases, that's actually not the case. So if you have a single multiplier, as you increase the value of that individual multiplier, you start suffering diminishing returns because you're increasing this number statically. So if you have 10 base, you have a 25% increase. Let's use morale from Europa Universalis as an example. So let's say you increase your morale stat and you're looking at your morale damage. So if you have 10 base morale damage and you have 25% increase to your morale, then you're looking at 12.5 base, or sorry, 12.5 total as the new damage value. Now, if you increase this modifier, so you now have 150% morale, then you're increasing the value to 15, which is only a 20% increase over the 12.5 that you started with. So you're suffering from the same diminished returns that you would with a static increase because your actual modifier is increasing statically. However, if you increase the quantity of multipliers, so instead of having a single 50% multiplier, you now have two 25% multipliers. So as an example, you have 10 base damage, then you have a 25% increase in morale, and now you have an additional 25% increase in discipline, both of which increase damage in the same way. Then you end up with 15.625 instead of just the 15, and that's a full 25% increase as opposed to going with only 20%. So if you increase the quantity of multipliers, you can get stronger overall effects. So you always want to stack as many different multipliers as possible, and you can, as you apply more and more of them, you'll start getting sort of better and better, well, not better returns, but you'll maintain the same percentile returns of much larger values. So increasing the quantity of multipliers is very good. It's not as sexy as static decreases, but it's still pretty sexy. Multiplicative increases are where you're getting your damage from. Okay, next we have multiplicative decreases. Now, multiplicative decreases are really sexy, but a little hard to explain. So I'm going to do my best. So multiplicative decreases, what they are really doing is if you have a 25% damage reduction, you're multiplying the damage taken by 75%. So you're multiplying them by 0.75. So you take 1, you subtract your modifier, and that gives you your multiplier. So the multiplier decreases as the modifier increases. So what does that mean for you? Well, what ends up happening is you're decreasing the base value statically. You're decreasing the base multiplier statically, that is, which results in accelerating returns up to and including 0%. And sometimes you can go beyond that. So for elemental resistances, you can sometimes, say you have 125% resistance to fire. You subtract 1 by 1.25, and you end up with negative 0.25. In some games, it will allow you to heal for 25% of the damage that fire deals. So you're going from taking damage to healing off of a given element. Multiplicative decreases are some of the most powerful things that you can ever run into because of this. So multiplicative decreases, even if they don't allow you to get an individual modifier to that point, they very frequently will let you get a modifier to the point where you're taking no damage at all. So you can get 100% resistance and take no damage. And that is always. It doesn't matter how hard they would have hit you. It doesn't matter whether it's a goblin or a demigod. If they're using the same attack type, it sucks to be them. So let's say you have, you're taking fire damage, so you have fire resistance. If you have no fire resistance, a fireball hits you for 50 damage. If you have 100% fire resistance, you take 0 damage. Now, let's say that fireball is now a god fireball that does 500 damage. You're still taking 0 damage. So unlike the static defense, or the static decrease, it doesn't matter how large the individual value gets. Once you've zeroed it out, it doesn't do anything. So multiplicative decreases, if you stack the one modifier, if you have one multiplier that can reach 0, then you can gain total immunity to that kind of attack regardless of how powerful the individual attack would be, which is where multiplicative decreases get their power. Now, they do not get accelerating returns from multiple modifiers, but they still gain full benefit. So multiplicative decreases do not have a downside. So the returns that they get from multiple multipliers are the same returns as you would get from a multiplicative increase with multiple modifiers. So you're always getting the same percent return, right? So you're getting, if you have one modifier that's a 25% reduction and then another that's a 25% reduction, you're getting two 25% reductions. You never end up with diminished returns from anything that decreases a value unless they hard code in a diminished return for a value. So multiplicative decreases are the sexiest of the sexy. These are the things that allow you to get real, just utter God mode and gain complete invulnerability to attacks. They allow you to make bosses trivial because all of a sudden they go from having these super powerful attacks to having no attacks that can hurt you, things of that nature. Multiplicative decreases are where it is at. All right, so that's the end of this video on sort of the total basics. So hopefully this was useful for you guys. I think that a lot of people don't really understand how these types of values interact with each other, and I think that I'm often told, wow, I can't imagine that you have done this thing. How you must be super skilled in order to be able to do whatever nonsense thing I'm streaming. And I'm not really that skilled. It's not a matter of like actual skill at a given game. It's just a matter of math. Math is the great equalizer that gives you so much power when you're dealing with fundamentally mathematical systems, which is what video games are. So hopefully this has been useful for you guys, and next time we'll go into a specific game and sort of figure out how to become a god within a specific context of a game.